Well, thank you, John. It was a very good way to present me, and I didn't feel embarrassed as usual. When they introduced me, I feel like I'm listening to my obituary. Well, you talked about my father, and I will start by asking myself, what were the feelings of his generation? My father was born in 1900. And people of that generation experienced in their lifetime the worst possible abuses of national sovereignty in the first half of the 20th century. You see, in 1914, the word civilization did not have a plural. There was civilization and other ways of living. And civilization was European civilization. The rest of the world was either a European colony or a former European colony or too far away to matter. Europeans were 1/4 of the population of the planet, 25%. In 1945, only one generation after that, Europe had gone from being the world, wars were fought for Europe and in Europe, to being, as an American of great humor observed, the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. In the world of superpowers, Europe did not matter anything. So people of that generation, having seen the abuses of national sovereignty for 50 years, 2 world wars, the hyperinflation of Weimar, the Great Depression, the Hungarian hyperinflation, grew suspicious of national sovereignty. For them, since it could be abused, it had to be tamed. For them, there was necessary a mechanism that would tame national sovereignty and also would give Europe, again, a role in the world, a voice in the world. This was the European ideal, and I consider it as the most noble and highest ideal Europeans were offered by history in the 20th century. What happened afterwards is that from that ideal came a bad surprise. In 1954, the French Parliament refused to ratify the treaty creating the European Defense Community. And that's strange because it had been France, it had been the French that had wanted the European Defense Community. But in the national elections, the left won, and indeed won the ECD. All Europeans were very upset because they thought that their hopes had come to an end. In 1954, because of a domestic scandal, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Attilio Piccioni, resigned, and Alcide de Gasperi, who was the great Christian democratic leader on his deathbed, recommended that his place be given to the Minister of Education. That happened to be my father. So in 1954, my father moved from the Ministry of Education to the Foreign Ministry. And the first thing he did is he convened a meeting of the Foreign Minister of the Steel and Coal European Commission to be held in Messina, his hometown, on June 1st and 2nd, 1955. The foreign minister of what was called the Little Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Italy, convened in Messina on June 1st and in Taormina on June 2nd. They came, on my father's suggestion, to the conclusion that times were not ripe for political unity, as evidenced by the failure of the ECD. So they decided to opt for economic integration instead. And this for 2 reasons. First, because economic integration is desirable per se. And second, because as pointed out by Frédéric Bastiat in the 19th century, where goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. It's also a factor of peace, because commercial warfare often precedes real warfare, and it's an element of hostility among nations. Instead, free trade creates integration and harmony. It was not an easy decision. It was difficult. It was opposed by the communists. It was opposed by the trade unions. It was opposed by the right that saw in this economic integration a danger for national identities. It was opposed by the Confederation of Italian Industry that feared the Italian industry could not compete with European industry. But it passed. It led to the Conference of Venice on 1956 and to the Treaties of Rome on 1957 that my father signed. The Treaties of Rome created not only the European Common Market, but also the Euratom. The idea was that Europe could not have a really free foreign policy if it depended for energy on the importation of oil from dubious countries. The project of Euratom was abandoned, and that's too bad. But what happened to the common market deserves to be talked about. The idea succeeded in that all countries benefited from greater trade among European nations. However, developments at the intergovernmental treaties, which led to the formation of the European Union, did not work in favor of a greater political unity of the whole continent. On the contrary, because they confused uniformity with unity. You know, in the United States, they have a federal government, but each state is free to choose the kind of car license plate it wants. Making all car license plates of the 50 states of America equal would not make the United States more united. They would just make it more uniform. The European Union has forced member states to adopt the same kind of car license plates. That did not bring us closer to unity, but it decreased variety, increased uniformity. And I could repeat example after example of the things that the European Union has done. John mentioned that I'm considered Eurosceptic. I do not consider skepticism to be an insult. The opposite of skepticism is dogmatism. Skepticals have done no harm to anybody. Instead, it was dogmatists that have harmed people. Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, you name them, they were all dogmatists. They were not skeptical. I am skeptical because I want to be shown some evidence of what they say. Once, before going into politics, I accepted an invitation to join in Bruges, members of the Bruges group. And I went there and gave a talk. I'm sure John knows most of them. And I told what I thought about progresses in the inter-European treaties. There was an Italian journalist present who was the author of a small press agency in Brussels. And he was a Euro-fanatical who dedicated a whole page insulting me. The son of Gaetano Martino is against Europe, etc. No one noticed this agency because no one read it at that time. But when in 1994 I ran for parliament, on a TV show, one of the members of the former Italian Communist Party attacked me for being Eurosceptical. I said, "How dare you tell this to me? You filled all the walls in Italy with posters saying that my father had dilapidated public money to organize the Messina conference. It cost 5 million lire. That's 2,500 euros. Not very expensive. And now you tell me that I am Eurosceptical." So he shut up and I went ahead. This story, however, of Euroscepticism has continued to follow me. When I became foreign minister, I circulated a paper of mine critical of the way they intended to create a common currency in Europe, a single currency in Europe. And I gave it to ambassadors, all Italian ambassadors in Europe. I don't think they read it, and those who did not understand it. But you know, that reinforced the idea that I was anti-European. I am not. It's because I believe in Europe that I cannot approve at all of what the European Union is doing. The European Union is not moving towards political unity. It's moving against the possibility of ever having political unity. I know that what I'm going to say is a bit osé, but you should forgive me. I'm an old man, so I can say something osé every now and then. There was a European director done by the European Economic Community legislating what the European condom should be like. When receiving this directive, the Italian Minister of Health indicated a length that was bigger than the European. And this raised the question, on what legal or factual grounds does the Italian Minister of Health believe that Italians need more space? There is no reason why Italians should have more space. You know, these stories are humorous, but they're true. 99% of what is done at the European level has absolutely nothing to do with Europe. Absolutely nothing to do. We probably have gone too far in the direction of reducing national sovereignty. You see, the abuse of national sovereignty, I know, is very bad. But national sovereignty per se is not necessarily bad. It all depends how it's used. If it's used in a way, the way Hitler used it, the way Stalin used it, well, that's bad. But if it's used the way the Swiss use their national sovereignty, I don't think anybody could complain. Talking about Switzerland, the European Union wants to create tax harmonization, which means it would like to have no fiscal havens. Now, I believe that if we are still somewhat free, this is due to the fact that there are countries that pursue different tax policies. Tax competition is the reason why Switzerland is the richest nation in Europe. You see, in 1970, Switzerland was the second in the list of countries of the OECD with the highest per capita income. And Sweden was third. Now, on paper, there is no reason why Switzerland should be so rich. It's not homogeneous ethnically, it's not homogeneous linguistically, it's not homogeneous religiously, and it's almost completely without natural resources. Sweden, on the other hand, is homogeneous linguistically, ethnically, religiously, and it has large amounts of natural resources. So of the two countries, Sweden was the one that had better starting point. Today, In the same list, Switzerland is still second. Sweden is at the 18th place. Why did it drop down? Because in 1970 it started to introduce an extensive and very expensive welfare state, with the result that it had to increase taxation very rapidly to finance public spending. There have been years when the public spending in Sweden was more than 60% of national income. You know, I went to Stockholm once in 1989, I think, to give a talk to the Swedish Association of Taxpayers. And I realized that the activity most popular in Sweden was trying to evade taxes. No car downtown Stockholm is owned by the person who drives it. It's usually owned by the company that allows him to drive it. In the restaurants of Stockholm, you don't have people going and paying out of pocket. No, they can go only if it's a lunch offered by the company that pays for the lunch. That year in Sweden, there was a new party, New Democracy. Its leader, Count Jan Wachtmeister, had a slogan: if we win, the Swedes will be able to go to the restaurant like the Italians. You know, I was invited at a cocktail party in a beautiful house by a lake, and I told the owner it's a beautiful house. He said, I hope the lake takes some of the land. And I said, why? Because water is less taxed than land. And I said, but is this your house? Oh, he said, no. The house belongs to the company for which I work, and I rent it from the company. I asked a Swedish friend of mine, he said, yes, he's right, but he forgot to tell you that he's the sole proprietor of that company. This is what they do. They do back scratching. Your daughter needs some dental work done. The dentist needs some plumbing fixed. The plumber goes, the daughter has teeth fixed, the plumber fixes the plumbing of the dentist, and not one penny goes by, and they don't pay taxes. The result was that Sweden dropped down in the list of wealthiest countries, and Switzerland remained in its place. Now I want to conclude, because otherwise I will talk all night, with the challenges of the present. Today in the world, there are 1 billion males aged 15 to 29, what demographers call fighting age. Of this billion potential fighters, 65 million are European, 300 million are Muslim, mostly located in the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea and in the Middle East. These potential Muslim fighters are unemployed and in misery. And they've been convinced by Islamic propaganda that their miseries are due to the sins of the West. With the military technologies of the past, this demographic imbalance would have resulted in conquest. Europe would have been conquered by the Muslims. With today's military technologies, that outcome is not possible. So we have to put up with the two junior brothers of conquest: terrorism and mass immigration. Both problems involve all of Europe, not just one country or two countries. For both problems, the European Union is not ready to have an answer. And we are putting up with both terrorism and mass immigration. In fact, thus far, mass immigration has not been as bad as most people claim. But this is just the beginning. And not saying that terrorists usually travel like immigrants. The terrorists travel in first class in airplanes, or they are born in the country where they do terror. Europe is demographically moribund. 30 nations in Europe have a fertility rate of less than 1.5, which means that demographically they're moribund. Of these moribund European nations, Italy is the one that's worse off. In a list of 226 countries by fertility ratio, we are 212th. Our population would have started to decline if it wouldn't have been for that modest input of immigrants. I refuse to believe that 3,000 years of uninterrupted civilization can end because of the stupidity of today's leaders. I think Italy will make it, and I hope it will. Thank you.